Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, so I guess I had a problem with my mic. So in that case, we can proceed. Yeah. Okay, so we are looking at the second chapter. I was saying that it's also a foundational chapter that looks at policies from a different perspective. Policies as informed by different industry standard frameworks um, and other items that other models that determine policies that are issue specific in different enterprises. Yeah? So what we are going to do is we are going to look at some specific things that or terms or concepts that we will always come across when we look at policies, especially from a standards and frameworks point of view or from a models point of view. Yeah. So we have concepts such as compliance and governance, and we also have frameworks and standards. Yeah. Okay. So generally, compliance and governance almost refer to the same thing, only that the perspectives differ. Yeah? So governance is sort of an oversight approach to having guidelines on how an enterprise or an organization will meet the specified policies or security requirements. Yeah? So by having management involved to achieve our security requirements, then we are having governance, yeah, defined. Yeah. Then compliance looks at the same thing, how much we conform to what the policies define, but we look at it from an external point of view. As an enterprise or an organization, do we meet the requirements that we should have in that particular industry? Yeah? So compliance looks at laws and regulations and acts in a particular industry that an enterprise operates in and that an enterprise should try and meet, yeah, or should try and obey or conform to or comply with. Yeah? So compliance in most cases is a bit voluntary, but helps some organizations um, ensure that they provide security, especially in terms of user data in that particular industry. For example, if you're in or the finance industry or in programming or in networks, then there are some standards that you have to conform to. Yeah? For example, if you are in a network and you need to say guarantee that you have quality services or quality access to resources, then you must follow some particular standards. For example, ITIL, an infrastructure library for IT systems, which cascades across information security as well, will be a nice way to guarantee that in an enterprise, you provide services in a manner that ensures all stakeholders are more or less satisfied, in a manner that guarantees assurance of quality of service or security of data or generally the satisfaction of the stakeholders. Yeah? But what are these standards and frameworks? So these standards and frameworks are sort of best practices, sometimes defined differently across different industries, that guide the operation of these controls or tools or procedures or mechanisms that we might have in place to try and guarantee information security. So based on risk assessment, we might have different security strategies defined by the management. Now, having some way of guaranteeing that these security strategies are followed and implemented, not just correctly, but with the levels of priorities that are required, then that is where governance comes in. Yeah? Having an external entity review your processes in accordance with some particular standards, then that is where compliance falls under. Yeah? So organization standards or the governance looks at it from an internal point of view. You want guaranteeing that the operational level and the middle management level actually follow the strategies defined at the strategic level. Yeah? Okay. So we will look at some of the most common frameworks that you will come across in information security. And there are a couple of them. They started as industry-specific standards, but nowadays cut across almost all disciplines. Also, most of them started as general IT deployment or services frameworks, but right now cascade across most other concepts and include information security as an aspect of service delivery information systems. Yeah? So we have a list here, a couple of them, but the three which will be most common include COBIT. At this point, we are at version 5. Then we have the ISO 2700 family of standards defined by the International Organization for Standardization. And we also have the NIST standards, which again cut across multiple variations of disciplines and industries. Yeah? Then we have others that we might not look at in this set of slides, but are important to consider, such as internet security controls, which looks at IoT systems, and the NAC critical infrastructure protection standards, which normally looks at mostly power systems. Yeah? So we can start with COBIT. Now, all these are frameworks that define information system security, and they will look at different types of controls. They will look at technical controls. They will look at policy controls. They will also look at human level controls, more or less. Yeah? So the idea is to not just guarantee security, but also quality of service and also assurance from an objective level. Objective level meaning what is acceptable across that particular industry. Yeah? Now, the COBIT framework is very broad. I can give you different documentations on it. You can also find different categories of documentations online. It's very well documented. But if we were to summarize the expectations of COBIT, then it's mostly defined in four steps or four stages. Yeah? So it looks at how to plan and organize information resources and controls, how to implement the controls or acquire them, assuming they are not built in-house, then how to implement them, so how to deliver the controls and support them, and finally, how to monitor and evaluate these controls that have been implemented. Yeah. So because of how broad the framework is, I tried to break down the different components so that it's slightly easier for you to probably see how the framework works. However, um, I am not an oasis of knowledge, so if there is better documentation somewhere else, then you can also consider it. Now, the columns look at the different stages or ways we can look at IT infrastructure. But in this case, I have tried to limit this to specifically information security. Yeah? So we have the plan and organize bit. And the idea is first to classify our information resources. Yeah? Now, in most cases, we look at classification in terms of what is most important, what should be accessed by who. So we can classify objects and subjects trying to access these objects, yeah? As we will see slightly later in models. Yes. Then before we look at controls that need to be implemented, then there has to be information that guides what controls need to be implemented. Yeah? So the risk assessment bit or the risk management bit is what informs that part. Enterprise, it is not possible to implement all possible controls for security. Just like it's not possible to have a policy define all possible facets of security. Yeah? So we have to look at what are the most obvious vulnerabilities and points of exposure. And based on these exposure levels, what will be the most appropriate controls to have in place to try and reduce the level of risk that we face or that we experience as an enterprise. Okay? Then we also look at user awareness. At what level do we have the user awareness in terms of security? Okay? So are the stakeholders trained in terms of the controls, how the controls affect the access to data, and why it is important to have these controls in place. Then finally, it also looks at security as part of design. Yeah? Security not as an additional component, but as an embedded component in all aspects or in all projects that need to be implemented. Yeah? So it looks at inclusion of security elements or requirements, not as an additional function, but as an inherent part of any project that you have in place. Yeah? So that is the plan and organize bit. Then the implementation or acquisition bit. Yeah? So if in most cases, when you look at security controls, it is normally recommended that most security controls are actually brought in as opposed to built in-house. Yeah? And the idea is if security is going to be objectively included in our project, then we have to have security looked at from an objective point of view. And the assumption is an external individual will have a more objective look at the requirements of the enterprise in terms of information and data security. So in case there are some modules that need to be developed, then there is definition of security mechanisms that need to be included in the development process. Yeah? Now, COBIT is a high-level framework. Sometimes it includes other frameworks or standards to define how development should be done or how configuration should be done. Yeah? So some of the other frameworks are actually recommended in COBIT as part of the development standards that can be utilized either for development or configuration. Yeah? So the NIST, the ISO 27000 standards are also there. IT, Information Technology Infrastructure Library, which is ITIL, is also recommended as a standard that can be used. ITIL simply looks at service delivery. Yeah? So how do we modularize services in an enterprise? Yeah? How do we deliver these services in a manner that best satisfies all stakeholders? Yeah? So it's about modular deployment of services. What at this point, from an IT point of from an ICS point of view, you would refer to as mostly containerization. And what from a telecom's point of view, you will have as zones of trust or segmentation of the enterprise, so that you have different segments of the network requiring different security components. Yeah? Then there is a bit on third-party users. So we have service providers who may plug into the enterprise. So what are the requirements? What are the guidelines for them to operate within this acceptable security framework? Then finally, we have change control, which is simply about transition from different versions. Part of it is, the last bit is monitor, which implies checking whether the security requirements, and if not, what modifications do we do in our cycle again to try and have better controls or better products or better service delivery. Yeah? So change control tries to look at how do we move from version 1 to the next, what improvements have been made, and how do we track the changes. Yeah? Then delivery and support looks at, in the case where you have other service providers, then do we have SLAs, service level agreements, that define the security levels that we expect? Yeah? If part of our security is availability, do we have acceptable availability levels in our SLAs? Yeah? Do we get the 5 nines availability that systems offer? Yeah? Do we have business continuity planning procedures, which simply means, do we have alternate ways to access data? Yeah? In business continuity, you look at how are backups done. Do we have cold and warm sites or hot sites? Do we have mirror sites? In the case of disasters, do we have, say, mobile sites that can probably provide access to data temporarily? Yeah? Then finally, we also have physical access control to physical security, which mostly protects the hardware dimension. Yeah? Then we have monitoring and evaluation, which is simply looking at everything that we've more or less covered. Is it pushing us towards getting to the acceptable profile of risk that we want? Profile of risk or risk profile simply refers to in the event of successful attacks or successful threats, then what kind of losses will we have? Are these losses acceptable? This is simply because in reality, we cannot reduce the losses to zero. So we can't zero the losses. We can only reduce them to some acceptable levels. Yeah? So the levels of risks that are acceptable across different enterprises more or less defines risk profile or the risk appetites of these enterprises. Yeah? COVID 5, to be specific, more or less looks at these four dimensions and uh, um, how to culture the controls that we need to have in enterprises to meet these four dimensions. And the idea of meeting these four dimensions is to try and reduce the risk levels to the lowest possible values for that enterprise. Yeah? Then we have the ISO 27000 family of standards, which looks at basically the same sort of dimensions as COVID, with a little variation. Also based on another four set of activities. Yeah. So there is the plan, do, check cycle, which revolves around the same things as COVID. Yeah. So the idea is to look at what risk we face in an enterprise as stakeholders, for the processes, for the data. Yes, Tyrone, you have a question?
Oh, sorry. No.
Okay. So for the people, for the processes, for the information resources, and so on. Yeah. So there are different substandards within this family of standards, and they sort of complement each other. Yeah? So one defines simply how to manage a security policy or security program, which is so a security program simply looks at a particular in an enterprise. Yeah? So a policy might be very high level, defining what is required in that enterprise. A program will look at a particular thing. For example, how do we use ICT infrastructure? What is the acceptable use for the infrastructure? We can look at programs that revolve around email security or email privacy, or other items that are a bit more recent, like bring your own device and teleworking and so on. So the first standard looks at how do we manage the program? How do we define it? What will be the life cycle of this program? Yeah. So again, they're very broad, so that we look at the different standards or substandards or mini standards, just so that the standards and substandards don't conflict in terms of the inherent meaning. Okay. So one is about the definition of the program. The second one is about implementation of the controls based on the program. Yeah. Then we have the third one, 27003, which simply looks at best practices in terms of implementation. So when you look at the three, they actually sort of go hand in hand with the different stages or dimensions of the COVID framework. They might not have a direct one-to-one mapping, but there are similarities. Yeah. So you can see the similarities for the first one with identification of assets, basically the planning and organization of information assets. And the subsequent ones are in line with the other three. Yeah. So generally there are 6 substandards or sub-standards within the ISO 2700 standards. Yeah. You can look at them in a bit more detail. For example, from a programming point of view, you will be a bit more interested in the standards that revolve around implementation and acquisition. The same thing applies to the telecom students. You will also want to look at that, especially in terms of the configuration of devices. Yeah? What are the best practices? When you look at device hardening, how do you handle out-of-the-box configurations, which are very common in telecom systems and telecom networks? If you look at infrastructures such as mobile networks, and you look at, say, the transition from 3G to 4G, which reminds me, let's see which telecom students we have here. Yes, Lamek Kibet. What are some of the obvious transitions, say from 3G to 4G, and what are the implications in terms of information security? Lamek Kibet. Tara Kadeni. So anyone from the telecoms group, just so that we are all on the same page. Yes, Techno Camon 12. I am not sure who that is.
Oh, sorry, I was having an issue with logging in, so I had to log out of my account. Serious.
Okay.
So
What do you have to say? Mm-hmm.
So first of all, the most basic transition issue was to do with the billing, but now we have to. You find that in 3G it was using more of the radio. More of radio waves, and 4G was using more of packets, the IP packets. So you find that in 4G, the routing functions were pushed to the edge of the network, and so that they can connect them to an IP or packet core network.
Okay. So that's true. The most important transition is the transformation of the core to an IP-based core, which simply means the introduction of what we call the IP multimedia subsystem. And it simply gets rid of circuit switched calls. Yeah. Now, what makes the IMS a very good introduction is it's simply a service delivery core. Yeah. You can connect to the core for almost anything from any sort of access network, a 2G network, a 2.5G network, Edge or 4G or whichever network. Yeah? So when you introduce changes such as what we see from 3G to 4G, then there are multiple variations. For example, there's the introduction of a new frequency band. Then after that, there is change in modulation techniques. So all these are more or less aimed at better security for the access network. Yeah? So if the standards are defined in terms of how do you ensure security, how do you ensure, say, power requirements are met while at the same time maintaining that acceptable level of security. So you see, when you look at the different standards, they look at controls from a general point of view. Yeah? So if we have new authentication mechanisms or new access control mechanisms in the IMS core, yeah? How do we monitor the change, say, from Radius as an access control protocol to Diameter as the new access control protocol? Yeah? How do we define the versions of protocols, communication protocols, and not necessarily security protocols that that we've changed, that we've moved from? We've probably moved from SIP version 1 to SIP version 2. Yeah. What are the fallback mechanisms in case one of the devices only supports the first version and not the second version? Yeah? So this family of standards more or less looks at one, the program, two, the controls, three, how do we measure the effectiveness of the controls, and the controls are as generic as any industry that you can have. Yeah. Okay. So the specific, the second substandard of the ISO 2700 standards is the 27002, which looks at enforcement of controls. Yeah? So the first one looks at defining the program, what is acceptable, what is prioritized, more or less the planning bit. This looks at the controls that we can actually implement or we can acquire. Yeah. So when you look at this, then there are multiple domains that we can look at. Yeah. So what are the controls that manage access to assets? How do we define user behaviors? Which users are a bit more privileged in that environment? Yeah? How do we guarantee physical security? So there are multiple domains that, again, will have subcategories that determine what should be done for that particular industry or for that particular enterprise. Yeah? So again, it's simply a set of standards that defines guidelines or models that can be used to try and reduce risk, exposure to risk for enterprises. Yeah? Then we have the third framework, which is the NIST framework. I think this is the most common framework that is used across enterprises across the globe. And again, it's the same thing. One, reduce risk. In this case, it also tries to increase the resilience of mechanisms, cybersecurity mechanisms. Yeah? So it tries, for NIST, it tries to break down the approach to cybersecurity into three sort of components. Yeah? One is the core, which is a set of what is desired, yeah? A set of categories of processes that need to be done. Yeah? So the idea is is to sort of have an agreement in terms of what is expected in that enterprise for both internal and external stakeholders. Yeah? So it looks at the most basic steps, which normally are the identification of assets, how to protect them, um, how to detect threats, how to recover, and how to restore systems. Yeah? Then we have tiers, the framework tiers, which look at, based on the enterprise, there are levels that we would want to achieve, and there are levels that we are at. Yeah? So how do we move from level 1 to level 2 to level 3? So the tiers look at, we have risk that is partially known. Yeah. Then we want to quantify this risk such that we can look at what are all the elements of risk that pertain to a particular asset. Yeah? So we want to have more or less a repeatable process, yeah? An informed process. Yeah? So it's not just based on the most common threats that we face, but a list of all possible threats that we can have. So we want to move from partial information to a more informed approach. Yeah? Then the next tier looks at, can we standardize the processes that we have so that the controls that we can have are more or less repeatable for different scenarios. Yeah? So the idea is to try and standardize our informed risk. And then another tier, which is normally the highest tier, is how to adapt. Yeah? Is it possible to what should I use? Is it predict variations of risk that we can have based on what we already know? Yeah? Can we adapt what we have for any emerging trends and technologies? Yeah? And what we can do to move from a partially informed process to an informed process, from an informed process to a repeatable process or controlled process to an adaptive process is what the profiles more or less determine. Yeah? So the profiles are the opportunities we have to move from one tier to the next. Yeah? How do we transition from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3 and so on? Now, the NIST, again, is this is the general point of view, but it is also a set of standards. Yeah. Now, what makes NIST a more widely acceptable standard is the fact that it has substandards that are very specific to different technologies. For example, we could have NIST standards that define guidelines on how to support bring your own device. We could also have standards that determine or define how to include, say, Bluetooth or wireless LAN devices in that enterprise as a list of information assets. Yeah? So NIST has so many substandards that determine guidelines for almost every sort of technology, from IoT to wireless LAN to Bluetooth, to bring your own devices, to definition of security policies, and many other dimensions. So in most cases, they have the 800 standard. So they are normally preceded by the 800 standard, especially for information security. And we have variations of substandards within the 800 standard that look at different things. So you can look at some of the specific standards with regards to, say, what you would normally do if you were in the industry. For example, if you come from the telecoms discipline, you will want to know what are the guidelines for wireless LAN and wireless LAN security. Yeah. What are the standards for GSM-based networks? Yeah. If you came from the ICS point of view, then you would want to know what are some of the standards that that guide end-to-end encryption, encryption of data from a health informatics point of view, guidelines that determine e-commerce, yeah, the card industry, and so on. Yeah. So part of the core of the NIST framework is the five dimensions of things, but these define what is desirable in that enterprise. So it's part of defining what the enterprise would want to achieve, and mostly falls under that framework bit. Yeah. Then there are the tiers, which show the steps within which an enterprise can move from as they try to improve their security controls. And finally, what are the opportunities they have to move from one tier to the next from the profiles point of view. So that more or less defines the three most common frameworks that you will come across. Yeah. So the COBIT framework, COBIT 5, the ISO 2700X, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, and the NIST standards, which define how to have more resilient cybersecurity controls. So I think we can stop there so that we can now look at models in the next class, models that inform cybersecurity policies. So we will look at that more or less confidentiality. So we call them confidentiality-based policies. And really don't care so much about integrity, but unauthorized disclosure of information will be detrimental to them. Yeah? So we will look at confidentiality policies and policy models that guide these confidentiality policies. Then we will look at integrity policies and the model that guides integrity policies. Then we will look at a more holistic approach. We will look at Sun Systems network security model and more or less NIST and almost every other framework's defense in depth approach, sometimes referred to as the onion model. Yeah? So that should be the content for the next class. So I will take any questions. In the meantime, you can add your names and admission numbers in the chat so that that counts as your attendance. Okay? So any questions, concerns? Anything I should address? So I have been informed that it might be possible to split this class because the numbers might be too large. So I haven't gotten the confirmation, but I will let you know once I get the information. Yes, Gift.
Sorry.
So unless there are, I presume there are no questions, so I think we can stop there. You're free to leave the class. Tangus, I will get back to you. I saw your email, so I will get back.